Hey everybody, today is Monday, October 2nd, 2023. Coming up on the show today, from the Netflix live-action series One Piece, editor Eric Littman.
I was finishing up the pilot and we were on the stage and I was talking to one of the mixers and he said, "Hey, what are you off to?" And I knew I was doing this big show, but I didn't realize how big it was. And I told him, "Well, I'm going up to do One Piece." And he was just like, "You have to be kidding me. You're doing that? That's been like in the works for years. And I'm a major fan and we have this huge fan base." And I started looking it up and I was like, oh, wow. The pressure kind of just went up a few notches there.
Editor Kevin Ross.
I learned in my meeting when Matt Owens corrected me, he's like, okay, manga is the books and anime is the cartoon on television, those episodes. And he was very specific, saying they wanted to avoid the anime version and wanted to go from the source of the manga.
Assistant and additional editor Adam Pearson.
I am a very lifelong anime fan. When he told me what it was, I almost was hesitant to believe it because I was like, if this doesn't actually come through, I'm going to be so upset.
And assistant and additional editor Daniel Williams.
I like a few animes. I'm not quite as big into it as Adam, but my first thought was a cautionary tale of, hey, Kevin, fair warning, most other anime adaptations have not gone well.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Hey, how are you? Matt Fury here in the old podcast chair, ready once again to delight you with some true tales from the cutting rooms of your favorite films and TV shows. Maybe they're not your favorites, but they might be after you meet the talented folks behind them. And that's why we're here. To learn a little, to laugh a little, perhaps to love a little. Who knows? Something that is loved, or beloved by many is One Piece, a manga series created by Eiichiro Oda over 20 years ago. And it's still going. So clearly more than a few people are into it. Over the past couple of decades, it's been adapted into an anime series, which is also still going. But many thought that a live-action adaptation of this property would never live up to the spirit of what is portrayed in the source material and what can more easily be expressed in the anime format. Well, it looks like those people would be wrong, because the live-action adaptation of One Piece has reached the top of the Netflix charts and been the subject of many positive reviews. I certainly enjoyed it, enough so to want to meet some of the people behind it. I say some because it would just not be possible to have everyone from the post crew on the show. The podcast format is good for a lot of things, but not when it comes to hosting a large number of people. So I'll start by saying that I am thrilled to welcome to the show editors Kevin Ross, Eric Littman, Adam Pearson, and Daniel Williams. Adam and Daniel assisted Eric and Kevin, respectively, but ultimately became their co-editors as well. That said, there were other editors, assistant editors, VFX editors, that I just could not accommodate with this limited podcast format. Therefore, I beg you to let me express my regrets, yet admiration to the following members of the One Piece crew. So from Cape Town, South Africa, you have editor Tessa Vervis and assistant editors Joe Krenzer and Namfundo Lucia Masango, as well as VFX editor Korn Gildenhuis. Yes, there is a strong chance I butchered some of those names. And then from the LA office, we have editors Tersa Hackshaw and Tim Kinsey. Hey, I know Tim, good guy. Probably won't talk to me again after snubbing him. Sorry, Tim. There's also assistant and co-editor Marie Lee and assistant editor George Pilkington. So for all of those folks, I hope to make it up to you someday and have you on for a future project. Now, this extended roster I just read to you is perfectly emblematic of how huge this show is. I believe it's one of, if not the most expensive series Netflix has ever produced. The budget is big, the crew is big. The show was shot mostly in Cape Town, South Africa. They did some editing in Cape Town, but also LA, and they shot in some other locations as well. And if you watch the show, you'll see it was all worth it. Lots of fun. And I think this interview is fun too. But you be the judge of that. Before you judge me, won't you indulge me while I talk to you about the folks who helped to bring you this interview, those wonderful musical geniuses at Extreme Music. Ahoy, matey! Yes, I'm going to make pirate puns while I do this. Deal with it. Did you know that ever since Blackbeard sailed the seven seas, Extreme Music has served up the very best in production audio to film and TV makers like you? Music created by sonic scallywags like Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, Mark Mothersbaugh, and Timbaland. And you can explore the depth of their audio riches by simply doing a quick and easy keyword search on their website using things like tempo, lyrics, genre, composer, instrumentation. Speaking of instrumentation, you can customize the tracks you get back from your search. Just take out those vocals or leave in those vocals. Okay, vocals are not an instrument. Bad example. But you're smarter than me. You get the idea. Maybe you're not smarter than me. God help you. So for simple folks like us, we can just give Extreme Music a track that we like as a reference, and they'll find ones like it. How easy is that? It's pretty easy. New tunes are being added to their vast catalog all the time, and you can sample some of it on their Spotify playlist if you like. You can do all the searching and the licensing on their website, or one of their hardies at a port near you can lend a hand or a hook. So the next time you have a story to tell, set sail for the friendly isles of extreme music. All right, time to get down to business. We got 4 editors for One Piece. Please welcome Kevin Ross, Eric Lippman, Daniel Williams, and Adam Pearson.
This whole thing up.
I'm leaving that in, Kevin.
No, don't cut that out, please.
I mean, it was a fun show, right?
Yeah. It was a great show.
No, it was horrible. No, it was.
Kevin, you're Mr. Short Straw. I thought we would start with you and find out about how you got on One Piece.
Well, this was a show that my agents actually put me up for. And it turns out Tersa Hackshaw, who's another editor, we have the same representation. And I think she got it too. But I read the script. I thought it was cool. I unfortunately didn't come from a world of manga or anime, so I really didn't know anything about One Piece at the time, but it seemed intriguing and exciting. So I had an interview with Netflix, Tomorrow's studio reps, the showrunners, Matt Owens and Steve Maeda, and my director of the first block, Mark Jopes, who were all in Cape Town, South Africa. And our post-producer at the time, Steve Welke, was in Australia working on another show. So it was a worldwide interview, basically, a big Zoom. And we clicked, and I got the gig.
It's all about the big Zoom. Well, you ticked off a lot of names there, and I want to get back to that later on because there are so many players in this show. I just wonder what kind of impact that has in post-production. But we'll get to that. Mr. Littman, what is your story?
So similar to Kevin, I also had a meeting with all the same players. I had worked with Matt Owens years prior on Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So I was aware of the show for a number of years. I stayed in touch with Kevin. Then we had this thing called the pandemic that slowed everything down. And I thought maybe the show just sort of went away because a lot of time had passed. And when things started to open up again, I reached out to Chris Symes, who I worked with on Black Sails. And I reached out to him. He's a South Africa people. And he said, yeah, I would love to get you a meeting. So I took the meeting and I heard crickets afterwards. I was like, well, I guess I didn't get the job. And a number of months went by. And then my agent called me one day and said, hey, they want to bring you on, but in like 6 months. So I was like, I can't wait. So I had to wait 6 months. So they brought me on for episodes 3 and 4.
That's interesting. You brought up Black Sails. There seems to be some kind of strange crossover between Black Sails and One Piece, aside from the whole pirate thing. I mean, Black Sails done in Cape Town. I know of a few people that were on both shows. That's that's kind of interesting to me. But let's move on to, don't call them the assistants. They're also co-editors. I got to hear how you guys got these coveted gigs. Why don't we start with you, Adam?
I had actually been working with Eric on a pilot prior to, when did this show start? It started so long ago. Prior to, was it?
June of 2022.
Wow. So yeah, we had been working together for a couple of months on that. And Eric got in touch with me. Was it after we had wrapped on it or right towards the tail? I can't remember.
I think I called you and I said, hey, I'm doing this pilot. I need someone like right away. And then I had this other show that's pretty big.
Yeah.
That, if things work out well between us, I'd like to take you onto that.
That's right. Because the pilot was the first time that Eric and I had actually worked together. And it did end up going really well.
It went exceptionally well.
I will say that when he did say he had this other big show, I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds promising. And when he told me what it was, I am a big, very lifelong anime fan. When he told me what it was, I almost was hesitant to believe it because I was like, if this doesn't actually come through, I'm going to be so upset.
Well, it worked. You got it.
It did.
All right. And last but not least, Daniel.
I worked with Kevin for 4.5 years. So, I was his assistant and he my editor for many shows since before the pandemic and all the way through it. So we were working on another show when he started interviewing for this. I like a few animes. I'm not quite as big into it as Adam, but my first thought was a cautionary tale of, hey, Kevin, fair warning, most other anime adaptations have not gone well.
This is true.
Someone's got to nail it at some point. I think the balance worked out and it's being received well. So the final anime adaptation to finally crack the code. And But yeah, unlike Adam, where he was full of excitement, I was more like,
if they were, I knew taking on One Piece was such a huge swing too. So I was like, if they're going to try this, they've got to be ready. And I felt like they were.
I was finishing up the pilot and we were on the stage and I was talking to one of the mixers and he said, "Hey, what are you off to?" And I knew I was doing this big show, but I didn't realize how big it was. And I told him, "Well, I'm going up to do One Piece." And he was just like, this is a pretty seasoned guy. And he looked at me like, "You have to be kidding me. You're doing that? That's been like in the works for years. And I'm a major fan and we have this huge fan base." And I started looking it up and I was like, oh, wow. The pressure kind of just went up a few notches there. So I knew we had a big responsibility to deliver something good.
And I will admit, I was worried by Danny's cautionary tale telling me and pointing out Cowboy Bebop and things like that. But also, one of my best friends, like a year before, he's like, "I found this new anime. It has 1,000 episodes. I'm watching them all. It's amazing." And then when I got the gig, I realized it was the same show. And I told him, and he was one of the very leading skeptics of, can you adapt this? And also, I will have to say, I was so out of the loop on manga and anime that I learned in my meeting when Owens corrected me. He's like, "Okay, manga is the books and anime is the cartoon on television, those episodes." And he was very specific, saying they wanted to avoid the anime version and wanted to go from the source of the manga. So I had a quick education in what we were working on.
Seems like we have a mixed bag here. Some folks that were familiar with it and excited about it, familiar with it and had trepidation about it, and then some not at all. So whether you knew this world or not already, do you take it upon yourself to go in and watch a lot of the anime, read the manga, really just sort of get to know the history of this property that's been around for over 20 years, I guess?
I caught up with the beginning of this show. I didn't keep going and watch all the episodes, obviously. I learned enough to know where the story was going in my 2 episodes because I actually wanted to be surprised when I watched the other episodes, what was happening, because we were editing in blocks. So Danny and I, our first block was 1 and 2. And then the next editor on, Tessa, actually, she cut 5 and 6 or 7 and 8. I don't remember which ones were hers.
5 and 6.
5 and 6. So like when Eric and Adam came on, you guys were the last block. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And you were doing episodes 3 and 4. So They all got mixed up. But we were separated by time, and it wasn't like we were doing all the episodes at once or a rotating schedule. We each had our specific time we were on the show, basically. So I didn't know what Eric's episodes involved.
Well, speaking to the scale of the show you were talking about, I also watched a few episodes of anime and, kind of getting an idea of our first 2 episodes. But we were busy. Once this show started, we shot a lot of days on episodes 1 and 2.
Oh, just a few. Just a few.
Probably the most dailies I've ever seen on a television show. We were over 2 months of footage on just 2 episodes, which was kind of endearing. Like, okay, cool. They're really going to give it their all. And we're shooting the crap out of these scenes. But yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of time to sit back and watch it.
Danny, I've never heard anybody refer to 2 months of dailies as endearing. That's first.
Well, I will say we had, on our block, we had a lot of dailies. And the amount of time we were given to really craft these scenes and just make them, really polished, for me was a luxury. Because I was used to just working real fast, getting the show together and having no time to do what you need to do. And this, I was like, well, I can actually think about what I'm doing here. I can actually create some options and alts and then really explore material. So to have 2 months for me was like, wow, this is just great.
I think the sets were in Cape Town. I think you guys were in LA, and then they also shot in other locations. What was the basic workflow of production to post-production, considering you guys weren't on at the same time and were spread out all over the world?
Well, I have to say also, the reason they were in Cape Town at that studio is where Black Sails was shot, and they used the same pirate ships in a lot of cases and redressed them because they had the sets already.
Which was weird for me because I would recognize the sets from the previous show. But now there was clowns in them, so it started to throw me.
But when we started, it was interesting because we were working with Cape Town and we had to find a workflow. They ingested the dailies there in Cape Town, and we still had to get them in LA to our nexus. And so Danny was working that out with the South African assistant. And Tessa, she started out helping us because she had been working in Cape Town for years. So she helped set up also the workflow and assist until her block started. So she was probably on it the longest because she started working out visual effects and assisting for us down there until her block started, which she became the editor on that block. So, but Danny can explain how they did the workflow between two different nexuses.
Yeah, that was rough. I think I had 2 or maybe even 3 weeks before the first day of shooting, which was probably also the earliest start on any show I've worked on, because it was quite a big hurdle to figure out how we were even going to sync up the nexuses, the storage systems on both locations, which ultimately ended up being not really that useful in hindsight. It was a lot of disaster planning that luckily didn't come to fruition, so it was a lot more complicated than it had to be. So they would shoot the footage there, the assistants there would sync it and kind of bin it out, and then they would send that and sync it over to our nexus here in LA. And so that by the time we woke up, because the hours were so different, by the time we woke up here in LA, typically the dailies were sitting there waiting for us. So then we just wake up and, like any other show, grab the footage, get it ready, build the media databases, and get going.
Which was great because essentially we had a 24-hour cutting room. So a lot of times when dailies would be ready in the morning, Adam still, and I'm assuming you as well, Danny, had to do normal assistant work, but it cut the workload down significantly. So now I could start looking at him like, hey, you want to take a crack at the scene, or do you want to do some music, or really go to town on the sound, which Adam and I'm pretty sure Danny did as well. And so it just afforded us to really look at the material and really explore it in depth.
And shout out to the South African crew, because you never know what you're going to get with an international crew when you don't have a normal dailies house like we're used to here in LA. There were almost no issues. Everything was typically synced correctly, and they were on time. They were extremely helpful over there.
It was very streamlined and very consistent.
And I always heard it was more difficult for them anyway, because they had to work on local drives because of the security of their internet in South Africa. So they had added steps when they were working in Cape Town.
Adam, you had done the pilot with Eric, and he sort of teases you like, no, I got this other thing, and maybe it's going to fly and maybe it won't. I'll give you a call, but don't wait by the phone. Danny sort of walked us through the global workflow, setting up the cutting room for Eric as someone who's starting as an assistant and then ultimately leaning into co-editing duties. What's your role in terms of establishing what the cutting room workflow is for Eric?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of that comes down to, when you're working with individual people, everybody has workflows, and a lot of it has to do with establishing space for those workflows, because that's what keeps work moving, is having things set up in a way that you can slot into very easily. Eric and I had, the opportunity to sort of set that up on the pilot. And when it came to doing it this way, the only thing that was interesting about it is this is the first time I've had to do I've had to help set up a project workflow without ever being able to be in the room and actually set things up on the computer. It was, we were able to log in. We were using Jump to sort of network everybody together. And I was able to get in and set those things up fairly simply, but it was kind of novel to have to do it from halfway across town.
Yeah, I would think.
There was a lot of screenshots. A
lot of FaceTimes.
Well, you made it work. Speaking of making things work, your audience certainly going to have the rabid One Piece fans that are going to be staring you down like, all right, you better impress me because this kind of stuff almost never works. But then you're going to have people that are completely new to this world and are going to need a little hand-holding. So let's talk about the first episode and just the approach you took to introducing people to the world of One Piece and what kind of different iterations that first episode might have gone through to... I'll just stop right there and let Kevin finish his laugh.
Well, I'll say as someone who wasn't aware of the world as well, we relied on the script and the vision that Mark and Matt and Steve had, our director and producers. So we were going for that. And Mark Jopes, the director, had a very clear vision of how he thought all the scenes should be and what the angles, like his camera angles that he worked with his DP. But I did worry, and Danny and I talked about it. It's like, will this be accessible to someone who isn't aware of the show? Because Luffy, the main character, he's basically rubber and he can stretch. And when we were even locked, we never had any type of even basic adamantic kind of stretching stuff I mean, I tipped in some like stretchy arms with using the title tool. I like painted long arms and then I would 3D them to move. That was my efforts with the visual effects. But we had to trust that the audience would go along for the ride. And a lot of it relied on how good the visual effects were going to turn out. And luckily, when we saw it air, it was like, hey, they turned out great. Because we were done last September. So they spent another 9-10 months doing the visual effects on the show of our episodes. But as I was laughing about iterations, we did have many iterations of our episodes as we went. But when we finished, we thought we were locked, except for the opening of episode 1, because there's always going to be discussion how to enter the world of One Piece. And so there was, when we had to go, because Danny and I, we were already stayed on 2 extra months and we had to get back to another series we were on. But when we left, we thought the beginning of episode 1 is still open for interpretation and how they were going to change it. And at that time, Tessa had taken over saying she was going to finish whatever they shot and they cut a new version. But over the next 9-10 months, other people have feedback and ideas and changes, and then it opened up again. And by the end, Eric had recut the opening of 1 to a really cool opening of 1, which I was like, darn, I wish I was there for that because that was awesome, you know? But, and then Eric also, as visual effects came in, he got to actually see that doesn't time quite right now. I can shorten that shot and I can change the scene. So, you know, it became a collaboration, but months apart, basically.
It was pretty cool when I eventually got my hands on the pilot, which I absolutely loved when I first saw it. And I thought everybody, Tessa and Kevin and Danny and Joe, did a terrific job. But the advantage I think I had was I was able to actually get some pretty good temps from the visual effects team in there. We were able to get a pretty good idea to what we were looking at. Like Kevin said, every pilot, every premiere always has some sort of issue with the opening. So we were able to discuss that. And we had the visual effects team, Scott and Victor. I was able to discuss with them like, hey, you know, what if we had this for the opening, which they would quickly temp out for me. I'd get these pretty cool previses. And then that would start a conversation and the previs would become something else. And it was just a way to springboard into ultimately what we went to.
Just talking about as far as not being a One Piece fan and not having visual effects in the beginning, one of the things that the director, Mark Jope, said early on was there's a lot of action, there's going to be a lot of visual effects, but the story here is with the characters. So he was very deliberate in putting in these moments of character beats throughout action scenes and fights and all these little bits of, you know, cutting to Luffy and him making, you know, his small joke or whatever. And so by the time we got done with our first editor's cut, you know, it was looking at each other, Kevin and I, and just being like, this feels pretty good. Like, we'll see what they say. But, you know, even without all the big visual effects, it's like, this feels like it's working.
And that also speaks to like the accessibility of the story in general. You know, that is what the core of it, I think, that's the meat of it, is those relationships, those moments, those character things, to the point of fans and non-fans being able to be accessible to the story and the characters in the world itself. Like, that's the hook. And that's a thing that really was, I think, very clear. And I think it's one of the reasons why people who aren't familiar with this from the jump are able to slide into it. I've seen people write about it and I've heard comments about it of people who they didn't even think it was something within the realm of something they'd be interested in, because by nature it's sort of exceptional and outlandish, but the extraordinary parts are the background part, and like the substance of it is that it's those character stories, it's who these people are, how they interact. And I think that goes a very long way to getting people into it and giving them a place to have a foothold.
Knowing that first episode passed through so many hands, went through so many different iterations, there are a few choices I wanted to ask you about. A technique that gets employed a lot to help kick off a series, but also to help ground it throughout, to help sort of reset things for the audience, is voiceover. You start off episode 1 with Ian McShane doing a voiceover, which is great, but then that's it. We don't go back to that. Ian drops by for an afternoon, records his VO, and then he's gone. Was there ever any discussion or any actual recordings where there was more voiceover throughout the series?
When we were doing that opening, one of the big issues, or one of the challenges we were trying to figure out was, how do we establish this world? We were trying to figure out world building. Is this Earth? Is this not Earth? Are these aliens? Is it the past? You know, where are we? So we tried to do that with visual effects, which we did, but we still were sort of struggling with that opening. how do we explain this? So the idea was, hey, let's put a little voiceover here. Let's try to explain briefly what this world is. So we just get into it. And one of the great talents that I had out of Adam was that he had an acting background.
Oh, yeah.
And he did terrific VO, as I discovered during my show. And I would have him do temp ADR all the time, which I got to tell you was a blessing because I am not good at that. And sometimes we would get notes on Adam's VO because it was so good. Like, hey, do we have this or that? Can the actor do this? And I was like, well, that's Adam. So getting back to the opening, we did do a lot of temp ADR, which ultimately Adam was very helpful with.
I'm glad he had confidence in that ability because the first thing that he heard me do as ADR, if I'm not mistaken, is in the pilot. There was an automated voice that was extremely monotone and intentionally so. It was supposed to be very dry and very artificial. And I did the recordings. He's like, that's pretty good. So.
Something else I wanted to ask you about, again, knowing that the open was revisited time and again through different editors and over a long period of time. As Gold Roger is being executed, we're seeing close-ups of specific people in the crowd. And it almost feels intentional. Like I couldn't tell, again, because I'm watching the show for the first time. It's like, is that Dracula, a younger version of him that I'm seeing in the crowd? Or did you go back later on and go like, we have to make sure that we're going to plant some Easter eggs with some of these people in the crowd? How did that crowd scene, something that you would think is kind of just sort of like, yeah, it's a crowd scene, big deal. It really felt like there were a lot of choices being made there.
There were a lot of choices. It was a lot of footage, a lot of reshoots on top of reshoots to really hone that scene and get those Easter eggs correctly. There was a lot of discussion about that, and the Easter eggs that you're seeing there are definitely deliberate.
In the original shoot, we had the Easter eggs, but they were set up with specific younger versions. But I think in the version that came out, they had been reshot.
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, some of them.
Yeah, it was always intended to have those Easter eggs in that crowd.
2 nights before it came out on Netflix, they did a big show at the Santa Monica Pier and premiered the first episode, and hundreds of One Piece diehard fans were there. And just to hear their reaction when they saw those Easter eggs, they're like, oh my God, and you'd hear the gasp and the yells and the cheers when they even just saw some little snippet of somebody. So that made it all worth it, I think.
I felt like that was mission accomplished when I heard that.
Yeah.
So what does the world of One Piece look like as you're building it up from script to finished product? What I mean by that is storyboards, animatics, previs. There's effects in just about every shot, I would have to imagine. And if anybody was keeping track, I'd love to know how many VFX shots there actually were in One Piece.
A lot.
Episode 1 has at least 250.
And I do want to backtrack on something I said when I said we didn't have any type of visual effects. By the end, I'm talking like actual rough visual effects, because we had a VFX crew that when the buggy fight, the clown fight in episode 2, when he breaks apart his pieces, we started like, Danny and I would talk, well, we need these things spinning. And then the visual effects editors would make temp pieces, but it was like they were using animats and all sorts of things to make it work. But I didn't have at that time a previs version, except Danny had the sea creature.
Lord of the Coast.
Lord of the Coast. Luckily, he had those when he was cutting. That was one of Danny's scenes, and at least he had some basic versions instead of my painted. I painted like a sock puppet version.
Kevin made in the Avid Paint tool a wonderful sock puppet that that we used as the Lord of the Coast for eye lines and as placeholders. And I hope that one day that makes a bonus content leak, because it was, I think that's just a fun part of the process.
Yeah, it was awesome.
But I think if memory serves, Kevin, in episodes 1 and 2, we did also have pretty extensive storyboards for our big fights.
Yeah.
So for the Axehand Morgan fight and for the Buggy fight in particular, there were very extensive storyboards that really helped, because especially with Buggy,
right,
it's so hard to do that without visual effects. You have to really know what each shot's meant for.
And some of the fights we had stunt previses, which were great because they tried to mimic the camera angles even sometimes with the stunt. So you knew where the shots were supposed to be placed, basically.
They gave you a roadmap of all the choreography, really.
Yeah. So you knew like, okay, I don't know where this piece really goes, but here, I see what they intended. Sometimes you had to change them, but it worked out really nicely.
I had storyboards for the board game that they were playing in episode 3. And everyone made it sound like this was a really complicated game. And I was looking at the storyboards going, I think I'm even more confused. And I just watched the footage and it sort of just, once I watched the footage, I was able to make sense out of the storyboards. But then once I cut that scene, then they said to me, hey, by that point in the show, everyone was doing split screens. And they said, hey, can we do split screens? And how about we do a split screen on the board game scene? I went, oh, okay. Let me figure that one out.
That's interesting you brought that up, because I did want to ask you about knowing that things weren't necessarily in order, establishing looks for the show. And it sounds like it's impossible with One Piece, where you were all staggered. But at some point, somebody comes up with the idea of like, hey, how do I do this? Oh, I'm going to do splits. And then, oh, we did it there. Now that becomes part of our visual language, and we incorporate that in other episodes. How do you all come together and establish like, well, this is a path that we're going to follow for this show?
Well, one of the things that I asked early on when I came onto the show, and I had the benefit of being the last on, so everybody else had to go through the ring of fire. One of the questions I asked was, what is the tone of the show? Really, what I was trying to get an answer on is, what is the sound? What's the music, the score going to be like? And the word I was given was youthful tension at times. They wanted things to be paced up, but they wanted to have like a youthfulness to it. So I noticed that Thomas Newman was being used a lot for temping the show. So it sort of gave me a guideline on, well, he has a lot of ups and downs and waves, and that would help me dictate how the pace of the show was going to be. So I sort of used that as my guide to try to figure out pace of the show.
I think that's also a lot of where the showrunners come into play. You know, as we're working on our episodes with Matt and Steve, after they had gone and worked with another episode, they might be like, oh, we tried this there, it's working. Let's try to work it here. And then, or maybe like, oh, go talk to so-and-so about this effect that they're using to see if you can incorporate it in your episode. So there was a little bit of that as well, a lot of times coming from Matt and Steve.
And also, when we started, it was very specific that every block was going to have a different musical build. That was the talk at the time. They were even talking about having a different composer for each block. Eventually, they didn't do that. But, you know, we were thinking, okay, ours is a certain way, 3 and 4 is a certain way, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. So we were on our own. And we, at the time, when I wasn't sure what type of temp music to use, our director was feeding me things that he really wanted in. Even though the producers didn't want it sometimes, you know, they would say, no, that doesn't work. But, you know, there'd be a difference of opinion on the music. But we were like, it's temp. We're good. We'll change it.
So is there kind of a default pirate temp music?
Not Pirates of the Caribbean.
That, from day one, we were told no Pirates of the Caribbean.
Don't.
Yeah.
Well, for us, the problem was we were suggested to use White Lotus, and we did. And I thought it worked, but I had never seen White Lotus at that point. And you know, we got the feedback from Netflix, no more White Lotus music. And I didn't understand why, because I was like, it really works with this scene. But then when I viewed White Lotus, I was like, oh, yeah, that doesn't fit our show.
In fact, I think the only scene where the White Lotus temp stayed until we got composer tracks was the Zoro fight scene. The Zoro and Mr. 7 fight was the only one where the White Lotus temp worked really well, and we kept that all the way up until Sonia and Gianna gave us some options.
Speaking of those options, what I've read about the work that they did is that they were doing scores for character. Like Nami would have a theme, Luffy would have a theme. So I'm just wondering, with all the iterations you went through, when did they get integrated into the process? Because it seems like they almost need to be involved earlier than you usually would be.
Well, they were brought on early for our block, for 1 and 2. And early, I mean a couple of months, because we were still shooting. I mean, they weren't saying, oh, this is a Luffy theme. They just gave us a temp cue for the scene itself. Like, we had a great scene with young Luffy running through, stealing meat, running up to, Shanks's ship. I loved that scene. It was a little chase with the Marines, and they actually did a nice little cue with a fiddle type of thing. It was great. I loved it, but it got cut out. So it didn't make the final cut. Darn it.
Episode 1 was long.
And episodes 3 and 4, there were heavy Usopp and Kaya and also Zoro. And we had a lot of scenes there that were specific to them. And I would consider myself pretty good at temping with music, doing temp music. But these were long scenes. They were challenges, and I got some moments here or there. But I think somebody said, "Well, why don't we send these to the composers?" Which was kind of a new territory for me. I was, "Oh, I've never done that before." When I got it back, I was just like, "Wow!" They just totally elevated these scenes to a whole new level, and it was really making things work. Especially the Zoro climbing out of the well. When they did that, I had to shoot them an email and say, "You made me look good."
The Zoro and the well and the interplay between Kaya and Nami and Usopp and the guys in the kitchen, like those were very complicated, bouncing back and forth between one another.
They were originally linear scenes. Yeah. And I think somebody over Netflix or maybe one of the EPs said, somebody wants to try intercutting these scenes. And again, to the show's credit, they gave us lots of time to sort of figure this out. So Adam and I would look at these scenes, like Kaya and Usopp, when they're talking about to Luffy and Nami, their love for each other, or hiding their love for each other. We were playing with that scene, and Adam and I would sit there and go, well, if we added, and again, to Adam's acting abilities, can we change this line here and make Usopp say this? Or, maybe Kai can say this. This will get us to where we want to go.
If I didn't mention Zach Millman, who we had JTN Music was our music. They work with the composer Sonia and Gianna, and Zach Millman would do some really good sound music temps for us. Once we had a scene really locked in, if it was a bigger scene, sometimes we'd throw it to him to mix a temp track, and that was really useful especially on episode 1 early on.
Which it was nice to be on a show that allowed us to have someone to work on our temp music. That was really great.
Very nice.
First, I'm writing down, call Adam for any ADR. But Danny and I have worked with Sonia and Gianna. This was our 3rd show with them. So we knew what we were getting. We were excited when they were up for it. And we kept pushing, you guys need to get them. They're going to be great, and
they're just so versatile.
Yeah.
We've established that the paint tool and the title tool can really come through for visual effects, for creating sea monsters and rubber arms. Are there other little tricks and tools like in Animat and Fluid Morph that you bother to use at all to push the temp VFX, or do you sort of leave that we have a huge crew coming in to take this home?
Animat's all over Kuro. Everything. Yeah. So the thing with Kuro is that we were not going super far with his effects, but we had to sell them, and it was very specific. We didn't want them to be over the top. We didn't want them to be as they end up appearing in the show. They're very subtle, but they're still sort of dynamic. And one of the things with having to temp that effect is you would have to use a combination of an animat and a blur to get his little distortion thing where he starts moving too fast to see. There's also things in his fight with Luffy, which this is not only an animat trick, but also kind of just a general art trick if anybody ever has to do it. When he's crossing frame, right? He's not there. Iñaki is reacting to getting cut and stuff, but Kuro is not in that scene. And what I ended up doing with that is some of it's very sleight of hand, with his outfit is black and white, right? So you use a combination of the animat tool and the paint tool, and you can literally take a big black circle and a little white circle and blur and slide them a little bit, and you flip them across the screen, again, just for sort of an indication of that kind of thing. If there's one trick I used, it was is to give hints of how he was moving, because the way that we wanted to portray that was so specific that you couldn't get too big with it.
I think you added a few shots there when Kuro / Luffy in the mansion. I think you came up to me and you said, "Hey, I did this, but this really wasn't planned. What do you think?" I was like, "I think it's great." And it ultimately made it. You did that a number of times, and it ultimately made it into the final show.
We used a lot of small speed ramps as well, at least in 1 and 2, during some action fights where maybe the choreography was a bit slow. So either doing a small speed ramp in the middle of a movement where you can kind of disguise it where it doesn't look sped up, or taking frames out of the range of a punch so that the fist just moves a bit faster, taking just small, a frame here, a frame there out, and just kind of making these small cuts that ends up making it still look fluid, but just faster.
So before we get back to more story points, I did want to ask one more thing about skills. It seems like in recent years, assistant editors are having to learn new things and adopt new techniques. And of course, you have the usual things like, well, an assistant, they should know After Effects, they should be good with sound work. But I did have somebody mention to me a while back that people should be learning more 3D. And there's so much 3D stuff going on in this series. It reminded me like, well, maybe I should ask these guys, is that something that could be a valuable skill to know how to use Blender or something like that?
I think the main issue there is time. To make those kinds of effects work, you end up having to spend so much time on it. And typically, Kevin would be able to throw me a small effect and be like, hey, can you work on this stabilization or this paint out real quick? And I could maybe do that in 10, 20 minutes. But anything more complicated, we'd have to throw it to our VFX editors because some of those things take hours. And, we have other stuff to do.
Like if we have to do a complex comp, or if we have to temp in Luffy stretching or something, we're able to do it with a certain degree of believability so that you can watch it and it sells the moment. But when you're talking about something like that, when you're talking about going in and creating 3D elements and bringing them in, I mean, it is time consuming and it is a skill. It is a specialized skill.
There's also a problem too when you're doing temp effects where you don't necessarily want your temp effect to look too good. If the temp effect looks very temp, then everyone understands like, okay, this is temp and this is just to help you understand what's happening in the scene. Whereas if the temp starts to look really good, then you're going to start to get notes on the specifics of the look of the temp. And like, no, we don't want like, oh, we don't see enough hair on that arm. Like, okay, it's a stretchy arm, guys. It's not really, this is all temp. You don't want to get those kind of minute details on a temp effect. All you want it to do is help tell the story.
And to touch on that, one of the things when I was working with Adam on the pilot is, as most pilots do, they become something that other than what they were intended. And we ended up trying to solve a lot of problems with visual effects. And Adam drew the short stick on that one. And he had to design some pretty complicated temp effects. And it was something I kept my eye on while we were working together because I thought it was a real benefit that we could use for One Piece because, yeah, he's doing it all in the Avid. They were good, I would say basic, but really good. And when I say really good, meaning he was telling the story. And that's what I was looking for the most. So I was like, okay, this is somebody who understands story and what we're trying to say. So the shorthand becomes easier to communicate with them. And I thought that would be a really good skill that I'm always looking for people that are working with me, that I could utilize this for One Piece.
But I would say, or just want to add on, sure, assistants should learn as much as possible. If they can learn Blender or whatever, great. But it shouldn't be an expectation in the cutting room all the time because everything's been heaped upon the assistant over the years since we have been able to have more latitude in, we can put in 8 tracks of music and 24 tracks of sound effects and build all this up and make it sound awesome. But it just becomes such a burden on one person. We need to limit what the expectation is the studio is going to get for this.
I mean, a good example of that is the Axe Hand Morgan fight. I probably spent a full day doing sound design for that, one of our early versions of that Axe Hand Morgan fight. It was a ton. You had background clashes and with the sticks and the swords and everything. And, I thought I did a pretty good job. And then at some point early on, we sent that scene to the music editors for them to do a better pass. And, they did it in a night and it blew mine out of the water. So I spent a full day doing something that was very much temp. And the people whose job it is just do such a better job. And so it just becomes a bit of like time.
A funny note about that. I did a title tool. I made these fake hands that stretched out to grab Zoro and pull him back, these extended hands. And when I first did it, I got notes, the skin color doesn't look quite right. And I'm like, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
I will say, though, I know it's been touched on a couple of times during this conversation, but that is another thing that was very, very helpful within this team is that the VFX editing team did some really good work to help take the stuff that we laid the ground for and really flesh it out in a way that brought it into that realm that you're kind of describing.
Well, that reminds me of something I wanted to ask earlier, and that was, we talked about the scale of the show. I mean, the credits for 5 minutes, it says producer. I mean, there's just so many producers on this show. And of course, you have Oda-san, the original creator of One Piece. He wants approval of what's going on. For you, is this show the typical process? I do my cut, I do the director's cut, or is it the case where like you are getting a ton of notes and part of your job is to prioritize which notes to tackle first?
from my viewpoint, it's what I like about the Netflix model is you're not rushed to get your episode done because it's not airing in 2 weeks and you have to get it to the, the post sound house. But the more time there is, the more versions of notes you're going to get. Now, like when we went through all the notes, we went through the director's notes, the producer's notes, the studio notes, back to the producer notes, and then studio again, and basically latched our episodes. And we were gone before Oda had his pass. So, Eric, I'm assuming you addressed his notes for my episode?
I did, yeah.
We never really talked about this. See, so those little changes, I don't know what they were exactly. What I was happy was when I saw the episodes, I was like, okay, they're pretty close to what we had. You know what I mean? It's for generals. Yeah. So it was good to feel like the structure was still there. But as far as multiple notes, I don't know how you guys feel. I don't think it's a bad deal when you're on these episodes that can sit for a while.
I thought it was terrific. I really did. We got notes, like I said, intercutting the Kaya Usopp scene in episode 3. They were just one scene after another, and someone said, hey, can we do this? And when I heard this idea, I said, okay, well, when do you guys want to see it? And they go, oh, you tell us. And okay. And they just gave me the time to do it. And when I showed it to them, again, I didn't, you get so close to the material, you lose your sense of objectivity. And when you show it to them, you go, well, I'm not sure they're going to go for it. And I look at it, I go, oh, that's great. Let's do that. So to their credit, like Kevin was saying, they just allowed us, they sort of gave us broad stroke notes and said, here, try this. And then they look at it there and then, hey, can you fine tune this or fine tune that? And we're off.
Well, Eric, if you care to answer this, I picture the One Piece diehards listening to this going, what were Oda's notes? I want to know what Oda thought and what were the changes that he wanted to make. Again, if you care to answer it, I'd love to hear it. If not, I completely understand and we can move on.
Well, I will say he was very opinionated. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam. We delivered all the episodes to him at the beginning of the year, right?
Yes.
And we got back notes. There was, I would say, notes there. He was very opinionated. He was very complimentary. He was very happy with what he saw. But his notes that he gave us notes on were very specific. And what was great about his notes is he had little drawings next to them. So we got to see some private Oda sketches.
You might want to hang on to those.
I still have them.
I bet you do.
Can you send me the ones for 1 and 2?
Sure. It was pretty cool. He had a specific vision. Certain things we reshot based on his notes.
It felt like Luffy's the hero, the star, but this first season, I'm happy that we can now say this first season, really it's Nami's story that really the first season's all about her in a way. I mean, you understood that she was this, not this secretive character, but there was something she was hiding. And there was something not necessarily nefarious, but let's keep an eye on her.
Credit to Emily Rudd on that one. Even back in episode 2, I cut all those scenes with her and Zoro tied up and her in the cage. And she was just the lifeline. Anytime I needed to cut away for whatever reason, she always had like a good reaction, always like emoting exactly what you want Nami to be emoting in that moment. So that made those things a lot easier being able to cut to her.
Acting was top notch for these characters. I mean, these actors were really good. And especially Emily, I loved every time I got a scene with her because just the way she presented Nami was just really, it was great.
Well, and she took on a lot of the sort of depth you're talking about and like trying to help give a ground for the audience of where she is in the story. In that scene where Nami and Kaya are sort of having their moment and Nami gets to actually like talk to someone in a honest way, quote unquote. To me, one of the best moments that's in that scene from her is when Kaya asks her if she's ever lost someone close to her. Emily's reaction to that is very clean and very simple, but there is a tremendous amount of depth in it. And if you know Nami's story, you know what the truth is for her. And Emily plays that beat exceptionally well. I love it so much.
I believe she said she was born to play this role.
So knowing that, for each of you, I'll open it up a little bit so you're not so limited, but do you have a favorite character or a favorite scene from the series that you worked on?
One of my favorite scenes is a little scene in episode 2, but I just love it. And it was fun to cut because I got emotional when I cut it. And it was when Shanks gives little Luffy the hat. I love that scene, and I was just so proud of it when I was done. I just felt like, but I'm a sucker for melancholy stuff too. But I felt good when that happened. Even when I would watch it, I kind of would like tear up a little just because I was so into those characters at that moment. And it's not a big action scene. It's a simple scene, but I always go for the emotional character beats as my favorite scenes.
Well, I would say the action scenes in my episodes, I was absolutely thrilled with how they turned out. I thought the stunt team, they just nailed those scenes terrifically. So when I put them together, I was just like, wow, these are really good action scenes. I can sort of live in these shots a little bit longer. I was very happy with how it was cut and put together. But my favorite scene was when young Zoro learned his partner has died and he's sitting there by the edge of the river and the clouds and the sun are hitting. When I saw those dailies and what Emma Sullivan, the director of this episode, shot, I went, wow, this is next level footage. I was really impressed. And I was like, this alone, I'm in. You can't do much better than this. And she got terrific performances too.
I guess in a similar vein, and also selfishly, I got 2 of the scenes that I cut. The first scene I got to cut on episode 1 was the Zoro fight with Mr. 7.
And I never should have given it to him.
It was such an awesome fight. It was so good. It's a scene that didn't go through too many changes after we got going. And it was just such a fun, like fast paced, very samurai-esque fight. And so that was really cool. And then at the end of the episode, it's a hard pick because that was so fun to do. But then the emotional moment that I got to do was Kobe and Luffy's departure. And that was a big emotional beat that, oftentimes when we would screen it with producers, with the cue that we ended up using for temp and everything, it just it worked so well. And it was such like a kind of a heartfelt moment there for Kobe and Luffy.
For me, I think all of the cast, I think they're all really exceptional. East Blue being Nami's story, though, I'm particularly the emotional moment for me. And I've watched this show like 200 times, and it's not even for my episode. In 7, when Nezumi is taking Nami's stash, that cuts through me every single time. Again, because Emily is amazing at it. And then from one of our episodes, from Eric and I's episode, this is a very anime-ish, deep cutty kind of thing, but there's one shot that I absolutely love every time I see it. It's when Kuro is walking down the hall, coming to Kaya's room. There was a profile shot, and again, to Emma's credit, this is a gorgeous piece of footage. He's walking through this room in profile. There's light streaming through one of these shutters, and you get this live action representation of something that happens in anime all the time that I didn't think you could recreate in real life, where Kuro's glasses are almost bright white and the entire rest of his body is almost completely silhouetted in black. And I see that every time and I just giggle. I love it so much.
Well, I also want to add that the other scene that really affected me, which is a scene which Adam cut from one of our episodes, was when Usopp told Kaya he's not leaving her. And there was a lot of footage to go through, a lot of emotional beats to hit. And Adam did cut that scene, and I went, "Oh, okay, he crushed this." No, I don't think that scene ever really changed.
I love that scene. That's Jacob also did a really amazing job. And in that moment where he does make that decision, that for me is one of the most definitive parts of that scene, because he to the same point we were making about Emily earlier, he did something very powerful, very simple, and it made the whole thing sing for me.
Well, those were all great scenes, all very sentimental answers. I'm sorry to tell you, you've all failed. The only correct answer is anything with Buggy the Pirate Clown.
Definitely the favorite villain for me.
And 2, where he comes out and he's like, no, it's all wrong.
It's pretty good.
That is good.
Was that Buggy or Eric?
Yeah, there you go.
Well, guys, you did a fantastic job. You did a great job on this interview as well. I would almost call it endearing.
Thank you for having us.
Wait, are we recording?
Yes, thankfully I did remember to press record for this one. One of these days I will forget, and then, I don't know, it's probably time to retire. But not today. Today we continue on and thank Eric, Kevin, Adam, and Daniel for all their hard work on One Piece and for taking the time to tell us all about it here on the podcast. Do yourself a favor and carve out a few hours to kick back and enjoy this fun and unique series. Something that's pretty fun and, in its own way, unique is the preferred nonlinear editing system of the Straw Hats from One Piece, which is, of course, Avid Media Composer. What's so great about Media Composer? Well, a lot of things. Too many for me to list right now. And you don't need me to anyway. Just head on over to avid.com and see for yourself. Lots of great new features being added all the time for both the low-cost monthly and annual subscriptions. As always, if you need a little help with that, just click that link in the show notes and it'll do the rest. Well, once again, our little voyage has come to an end. And once again, I had a great time and I hope you did too. Thank you for listening, and thanks to those of you that take the time to reach out over social media or on the Rough Cut website just to say hello. I really enjoy hearing from you and learning about your own journey. Maybe someday you'll be on the show. I would like that. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.